Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be here with Dr. Nicholas Cole, who is the founder of the Quill Project, which is at Oxford University's Pembroke College. And we're really excited to have him with us. He is just has a fascinating background on the American Constitution. And so we're going to have a lot of fun today talking about just the history of religious freedom in America, how the Constitution, constitutional provisions develop this freedom, and there's a lot of fascinating things to uncover here. So, Nicholas, thank you for being with us today.
No, it's an absolute pleasure.
It's great to be with you again. I know that we've had a kind of a rough road in America so recently, so we're this will be nice to kind of take us back a few centuries to the founding and reconsider our roots.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks. Well, so Nicholas, tell me first just a little bit about the Quill Project.
So the Quill Project studies how America has written its constitutional law. And we really take seriously the idea that America's constitutional texts have been negotiated and thought about very carefully in very sort of formal settings by different groups of people. I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. It took them 3 months, about 60 people, about 3 months to write the Constitution in 1787. And you might be asking, well, what were they doing for all of that time? And the Quill Project is really about exploring how they went about that work, showing you, morning by morning, afternoon by afternoon, what they were debating, its context, and how the words evolved through debate. You can think of it in a way as a kind of track changes on steroids for historians, and that's really what we try and do. So we have a much more precise understanding of where America's founding texts have come from, but also looking at later constitutional developments and also state level constitutional development. America's got 50 states, and between them they've had 235 different constitutions, and all of those have been written in constitutional conventions as well, and they've also been amended many hundreds, even thousands of times too. So there's a rich tapestry of documents related to Americans debating rights, not just at the founding moment, but across time. And so the Quill Project's really about exploring all of that and giving Americans much better access to their foundational documents and a better understanding of how those texts have evolved.
Well, I love what the Quill Project has done for the Constitution. You've digitally captured and then you've made searchable the entire constitutional process, so that if you're interested in any of the debates on the First Amendment or any other component, slavery or race, any of these issues, you can literally search the entire constitutional database and find those topics and explore them. And so how long did it take you to do that? Because that is an enormous undertaking.
So we've been running as a project for about 5 years now. And the part of that time's been spent developing the software that we use, and a lot of the time spent doing documentary editing. But the original convention work, in fact, took us about a year to get our initial draft online of that original constitutional convention in 1787, and then we've refined it since. In fact, we're in the process right now of doing an even more accurate revision of those records. The Bill of Rights material took us much longer than we thought. We had expected that process to be very simple to capture. The Bill of Rights debates in Congress didn't take much time. But what we found there was actually that there are very few really good collations of all of the documents related to the writing of the Bill of Rights. So we actually had to do an awful lot of work ourselves to collate documents again and check it. So a project that we had originally thought would take us about 3 months ended up taking us closer to 2 years to do just on the Bill of Rights material. So some projects are quicker than we expect, and some projects much slower, and that's often related to the nature of the record and how well they've been edited in previous collections and things
how
like
many
that.
how many states do you have that you've now documented in the United States as well?
So the complete one that we've done, just because of a partnership that we had with a university, and still have a very close partnership with Utah Valley University, is actually Utah's constitutional convention in 1895, and that project again took us closer to 2 years. Again, we thought it would be a very simple process, but it turns out that state constitutional documents are very complicated, much more complicated than we'd expected. The negotiation process at state level was much more complicated than we expected. And again, it took us a very long time to really comprehensively collate all of the documents related to that. And we've since expanded that. We've got about 5 other state constitutional convention projects on the go at the moment, ranging from Massachusetts in 1780 through to Illinois' most recent convention at the end of the 1960s. So we're trying to cover the sort of historical range of constitution writing in America. Of course, the founding period is very important, but subsequent thinking is also very important. And we're trying to compare, as it were, the more historical and the more modern processes to see whether people's behavior at these conventions is similar or different. So that's a fascinating group of projects. And we'll have some of those additional conventions published later this year for people to explore.
Well, I think it's fascinating because what we're seeing now in America with just the recent election and the transition of power is how important state constitutions and state processes are. And so this federal system that we have is really coming to the forefront of how important how states legislators write their laws are in our country. And probably, I think we've seen it more this year than we've probably ever seen it in the past in our history. So I'm really excited about those projects and the processes. And I know that there's a huge difference in how states and the federal government were thinking about some of the issues we're going to talk about today. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. One of the things that I find really interesting about your project is how important it is for the people that are going into the Quill Project and looking at how these debates were formed and how the decisions were being made, is how diverse and often divisive viewpoints from racism and religious freedom, all these different issues, trade agreements, et cetera, federal versus the power of states versus the national government, how all of these different and divisive issues, how people were eventually able to arrive at an agreement and make these landmark documents possible. I think that what you call these negotiated texts in the Quill Project is really one of the best features that you bring that we've never seen really of that process. And at Hardwired, we work with people around the world who are going and struggling through these very similar processes in developing constitutional legal protections for basic rights. And we find that often the United Nations or international organizations or foreign governments will come in and say, well, just, it's so easy, just accept these laws. And they really undermine how difficult these processes are and how important and valuable that debate and dialogue is to getting a system of government that everybody really accepts and feels buy into. And so that is really what I think is one of the greatest features of what Quill has highlighted here. And so I'm really excited to talk about those divisive arguments and how they came at some of the freedoms that we have today. And in particular, the First Amendment freedom of speech, of expression, of religion, of conscience. So tell me, I guess first.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think it's really reassuring to remember that even the Constitutional Convention had to go through a process of debate and negotiation and compromise and really think through how to do that. And I think part of the American story should be inspiring for people now. That, writing a constitution, agreeing on fundamental rights is a really difficult thing. It doesn't take 3 months because it's easy. It takes 3 months because it's actually really difficult to find those compromises, and it takes time. And it's not as simple as just splitting the difference. Often when we talk about compromise now, we think in terms of, well, there's one position over here and one position over here, and the compromise is just splitting down the middle. And that's just not how the Constitutional Convention for America's federal system worked either. These were great minds, great political thinkers in many cases, but it took them 3 months to work through issues and find points of compromise and points where they would give way. I find that a very reassuring
Yeah.
story for the modern world, actually. And so that's why in the Quill platform, we try as little as possible to have pictures of white men in powdered wigs. If any of your listeners go to our platform, we've deliberately tried for a very modern feel, and that's partly to let the text speak, but it's also to make it a much more modern feeling process to explore, rather than making it feel historical and alien. And that's partly because, as you say, countries all around the world, and even still the US is wrestling with what compromise on a lot of issues mean. And so I think it's helpful to remember that the founding generation in America are much closer to us than we sometimes imagine. And so that, that's something we've really thought about in our visual presentation as well.
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head. So thank you. Now, tell me, as a British historian of American history, what attracts you in particular to the American approach to understanding rights?
I mean, partly it's just much easier, isn't it, to be dispassionate about somebody else's country. But because Britain, like America, has its own issues it's working through at the moment. But I've always been fascinated by the fact that the American legal and constitutional tradition and the British constitutional and legal tradition start from the same place and then diverge and take very different paths. And it's not that one country has freedom and another country doesn't have freedom, but we think about freedom and liberty and how to protect it in quite different ways. And in fact, Britain is moving closer and closer to the American model. When I first went to America in 1997, I was a student. I had the opportunity to work for a summer as an intern in Congress. And I was struck then just how differently Congress functioned to Parliament. But at the time, Britain was just about to get its first legal codification of rights. We'd never had anything like a Bill of Rights in English law. We had the Human Rights Act in 1997 for the first time. We don't have a codified written constitution in a way that America does. And America has not only one constitution, it's got 51 constitutions, all of which codify rights. All of those rights can be enforced in courts at state and federal level. It's a very different way of thinking about protecting freedom and the way that freedom works. And so I've always been fascinated by that difference.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And you definitely made me think about the differences in a new way. I actually got to study in England as well. So, and then I have also worked in the US Congress. So we've kind of switched. You were over here when I was over there, I think. We switched sides of the pond.
Well, transatlantic dialogue is really important.
Yeah.
I think, so.
Going back to the emphasis of the Quill Project which is on negotiation. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why that's such a key element of the Quill Project, and then also just the responsibilities that individuals have in understanding rights? What is your view of that? Because that's really what the Quill Project is all about.
So to start with the idea of negotiation, I think often when the work of the Constitutional Convention is taught to high school students in America or students around the world, often students will be presented with the Virginia plan for government and the New Jersey plan for government, and then they'll be asked to split the difference between the two, and it will take a group of bright 15-year-olds in a classroom context about half an hour to work out a compromise between the two plans that looks a bit like the federal government, and then everybody can move on. And I've always been fascinated by the idea that actually it took the Constitutional Convention 3 months. So what were they doing for all of that time? And the Quill Project really grows out of that and really thinking about how that process of negotiation and compromise worked across time. And so in a sense, how do people reach agreement about their fundamental rights, even when they start from very different places? Because if you had told the members of the Constitutional Convention on day one that they've got an hour to sort out their differences and leave, there would have been no federal constitution. They just wouldn't have reached agreement. The differences between them were really profound, and continued to be profound between different groups too. So I've just been fascinated by that story. We focus so much on the excellent outcome of those negotiations, that, as you say, sometimes it makes it seem too easy. And we should focus, I think, a bit more on the process of finding agreement. And so that's really what the Quill Project aims to help us explore.
Well, I think it has such great implications for today as well, because we see how many legislators try to really push through legislation in a short period of time without that kind of consensus. And then you don't have the broad support of the public, and how really undermining that is to the system of democracy that sustains those freedoms. And so this process is really essential for the functioning of a democracy, of a democratic republic, let's say, since we're not a pure form of democracy. But
Oh no, and before you can have that kind of agreement, the first thing you have to decide is that you're going to respect the process. So the very first thing the Constitutional Convention do is agree a set of rules that will define their debate. And that's what we see every Constitutional Convention do. First, the Constitutional Convention in 1787 did it very quickly. Other conventions have taken weeks and weeks to think through the rules. But the important thing is that participants buy into a process that reassures them that their voices will be heard, that issues will be discussed, not just once normally, but several times over before a final text is agreed. And that's what these formal processes allowed. So it's really, really important that people are willing to buy into that process and not seek to short circuit it for temporary and immediate political gain. And it's the breakdown of that kind of consensus that is at the root of a lot of the problems that we face. It's not that we must agree to compromise, it's that we must agree we will have a process for listening to each other. And when people short circuit that process, it actually becomes very hard to reach agreements.
Very well said. I mean, we could just end there because I think that was brilliant, but let's dive in. I would love to, no, it's so true. And it's so timely right now with everything that I think we're facing in our country, and just where civility and dialogue have kind of come to a head, and no one knows how to dialogue about anything. And part of it brought on by, these new forms of communication like social media, where people don't have to really dialogue. They can say whatever they want, and there's no repercussions. And so it really does undermine that traditional process of debate and arrive in the processes that help us arrive at working together towards real long-term solutions and rights and freedoms. So let's jump right in. So I'd love to hear about James Madison, the father of the US Constitution. He was very concerned about freedom of conscience in particular. I live in Richmond, Virginia. It's kind of the epicenter of Thomas Jefferson, and but Jefferson and Madison were involved in this debate over the First Amendment, and so just I guess like less than 100 miles from me, James Madison held a congressional seat and was a leader on this issue. And I've been to his area, and it's so remarkable for me to live in a place where all of this history took place and to think about it. So I would love for you to share a little bit more about James Madison. Tell me a little bit about, just as a young man, what happened with the Baptist preachers in his area that he saw, and how that impacted his view of freedom of conscience.
James Madison grew up in a Virginia with an established church, and not an established church like modern England's established church right now, but with an established church that was supported by laws that said people had to attend Anglican services, that preachers had to be licensed, and that people had to pay taxes to support the church. And some Baptist preachers, as a matter of conscience, refused to let the state license them, and others refused to pay taxes that they thought were supporting a religion that they didn't approve of. And people ended up in prison. These laws were actually enforced, and that, we know, left a huge impression on Madison. And all through his life and his work, in 1789 on the Bill of Rights, he remains informed by this experience, and he remains much more committed to the idea of religious freedom understood broadly in all of its different components, than many others in his generation. In some ways, he has a more far-sighted, even a more modern view of religious freedom, something that fits, I think, much more with how many Americans today think about religious freedom than many of his contemporaries. It's yes, the freedom to believe what you want. It's the freedom to attend or not attend church as you want. It's the freedom to have preachers that are not licensed and approved by the state. It's the freedom not to be forced to support financially religion that you don't wish to support. There are many different dimensions to religious freedom, and I think James Madison had a much better sense of that than others in his generation.
Yeah, it's interesting because John Leland was one of those Baptist preachers, and I think he even negotiated with Madison. He was running for Congress against Madison. The negotiated to allow him to take the seat, or to be the one on the ticket, in order, with the promise that Madison would really support this freedom in the Constitution. And so when I worked up on the Hill in Congress, every year we used to work with the Baptists to host the annual John Leland Religious Freedom Day, in memory of John Leland and this compromise with Madison that eventually led to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and then obviously the First Amendment to the Constitution. So it's such a fascinating history, and it's one that we don't often think about. But there was a point where we did have state churches throughout the country, or at the time the colonies. And these states that had state religions really dictated a lot for the individual and their rights. And that was something that had to be reconsidered as people of diverse faiths, within the Christian church, were confronting challenges to their individual freedom. So it's fascinating. Tell me a little bit about Madison's efforts to disestablish or deestablish state churches in other states. Was he involved in that? How did that work?
Well, so Madison writes the text that the first Congress considers, that eventually, through again a process of debate and amendment, becomes what we now call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Madison wanted, it's in his draft, he wanted an amendment to the federal Constitution that would have guaranteed religious freedom across America. In other words, he wanted a federal rule that would have been binding on all of the state governments as well. And Congress at the time votes that down. And Madison is very anguished about that. In the congressional record, Madison tells Congress, this is the most important provision that I've written into this text. And the Senate, we don't know why, because we don't have the full records of the debate, we just have the outcomes. The Senate voted it down. And when the Senate and the House were reconciling their different drafts, they just refused to go along with it. Madison's on that committee, in fact, to reconcile the House and the Senate versions of the Bill of Rights. And again, I wish we had the records of that. I wonder if he fought for it then, or I wonder if he thought that it was a losing battle. But I think at the time it seemed like federal overreach. This was this would have been a very controversial thing to say, in the first year of the new government, actually, we've thought about it again, and now we're going to have federal interference in this very basic question of religious freedom. So even though Virginia at that time had adopted its own statutes on religious freedom, other states weren't ready to make that move, and they retained established churches. It's not till the the 20th century that the Supreme Court starts to look at the American constitutional text and the First Amendment in light of the 14th Amendment, and start over time to really say that there is a right of religious freedom for all Americans, no matter what state they reside in. Throughout Madison's life, the First Amendment prevented religious establishment at the federal level, but he really failed in his efforts. Even though he was successful in Virginia, he failed in his efforts for national religious freedom.
It's fascinating. So the federal government cannot establish any religion, but state governments were able to, and it was never questioned really until, what was it, 1920? Is that right?
It's the 1920s that the Supreme Court starts to indicate that it's going to start enforcing ideas of religious freedom against the states themselves, and then that idea becomes, more and more articulated as the decades go on. So what we think of as, this fundamental American principle has actually been part of American life in the way that we understand it now, but for actually a very short period of time historically, even though the texts that we use to talk about it were written by Madison's generation, or at least the First Amendment was written by in fact, much of the wording written by Madison himself.
So Madison wrote this extensive provision in the First Amendment, and all we have left is the free exercise. I mean, we just have two very small clauses on the establishment and the exercise of religion, and that's it. What else? Was there anything else in there that was completely cut out, or was it mostly just de-establishing state churches as well?
No, he copied that kind of provision in a separate section of the document that didn't move forward, that would have bound the states as well. So he wrote two separate provisions, one for the federal government and one for the state government, and the federal provision is very similar to the text that we are familiar with, and then the state provision just didn't move forward.
Wow. It's just fascinating. And so that means then that the statute of religious freedom that they then passed in Virginia around the same time was really important and monumental, I think, for the country. But did any other states adopt that at the time, or was it just Virginia?
So Virginia has, I think, rightfully the claim to really be ahead of other states on this. As different American states revised their constitutions in the 1780s, 1790s, and subsequently, religious freedom is always part of that discussion. So, the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780 guarantees a freedom of conscience for individuals, but not some of these other provisions. So it leaves open the possibility of state support of religion in other ways, even if there is a protection of sort of individual conscience. So it's not that other states weren't discussing religious freedom, it's just that they were thinking about it in different ways, and sometimes not as comprehensively as figures like Madison and Jefferson tended to do. And that was really the debate on both sides of the Atlantic. You see the same thing with French revolutionaries, who again believed in religious freedom as an idea, but then didn't quite know what that meant. So when they are debating their own rights of man and the citizen, does religious freedom mean allowing licentiousness? Does it mean allowing misbehavior? Does it mean allowing disturbances of the peace on religious grounds? These debates recur wherever people start talking about religious freedom. It's one thing to get people signed up to the idea in theory, but often it's how it works out in practice, and how far you want to go in securing different kinds of religious freedom that becomes important. Yeah. And that's the debate that America's founding generation were involved in, and it's still a debate in America. There's a very important Quaker influence, or largely Quaker influence, on the American Constitution that we will see in just a week's time, I think, exactly a week's time from when we're recording, when the next president takes an oath of office, because the Constitution of the United States allows for the president to either swear an oath or make an affirmation. And that's because Quakers thought it was blasphemous to swear oaths. Swearing oaths in the 18th century was a much more religious and overtly thing, I think, than we sometimes remember. And some groups thought that it was blasphemous to use God in this way for this secular purpose. And so Quakers couldn't swear oaths. So if you make a person swear an oath in order to hold public office or to serve on a jury or to serve in any official capacity, you were really cutting out the Quakers at the very least, and other religious groups possibly as well. So to respect religious freedom and the freedom not to swear an oath but still play a part in public life, the federal constitution allows people to make affirmations instead of swearing oaths. Not all state constitutions at the time had that provision. So, again, it's such a small thing for us today, but it was a big thing at the time, and it especially signaled to Quakers that they were part of the political community and could take a role in public life.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Were there any other examples that you wanted to share, or just any other?
I think that's probably the best. It's very hard to. I mean, that has the merit of being one of the things where you can say, because of this belief, these words, and it's
fascinating. Yeah. I remember actually, and this might be a little off topic, but you had shared at one point with me how within the Second Amendment there is a provision related to religion. Can you share a little bit about that? Because
yes, so when the Second Amendment was being debated, and indeed when states themselves are thinking about their militia units, that there was a fear that if the wording suggested that Congress would have control of state militias and that people might be required to serve, that this again would pose a problem for religious communities that were opposed to violence. And so at various points as it's being negotiated, the Second Amendment, or what becomes the Second Amendment, had wording to say that no person should be required to serve in the militia in person if they had religious scruples against serving. And that in person left open the possibility that you might require people who refuse to serve to pay instead for somebody else to serve for them. But as Madison's generation were thinking about the militia and how America would defend itself, they had to think through, well, what were the religious implications of having these citizen volunteer armies and potentially requiring people to serve. In the end, the Second Amendment itself doesn't give Congress such expansive control over state militias that remained a worry, and so that wording's cut out. But you still see echoes of it in state constitutions in the 19th century that had these provisions for a state militia and then exemptions for service for people, and often those exemptions included religious grounds.
Well, and what's so fascinating to me is that this idea of conscientious objection was debated back then. We've seen it all the way back to colonial times. So this is always kind of embedded in the American experience. And it seems like it's always been really a core aspect of the religious freedom protections in America. So, I mean, obviously the Quakers being a great example of that as well. But I feel it's kind of interesting that you would see it within that context and within this constitutional debate. So I always
during the Revolutionary War, the Quakers had been sometimes suspected of sympathy with the British because of their refusal to fight. So the conscientious objection has been a really important part of the American story since before independence was fully achieved.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see how Madison and the other founders debated and struggled with these ideas of what does religious freedom look like? Is it a state's right? Is it a federal right? How does that play itself out in practice in the country, in this new country? So I would love to hear a little bit more about how America wrestled with protecting rights since its founding. So can you share a little bit about how do we agree on the meaning of American rights, and how do we decide how rights should be protected?
So America's federal system is very complicated, and everybody forgets, I think, or many people around the world forget, that state government is important as well. And so there are many different ways in which rights in America are protected. Laws are debated at state level, they're debated at federal level. Governors have veto powers that Madison's generation often understood to be principally there to allow a sort of last check for the protection of rights. When early presidents write their veto messages, or when thinkers like Jefferson think about the power of veto, they don't think of it in terms of just a political weapon that executives can wield however they like. They think it is best deployed to defend liberty. And then state courts and federal courts exist in ways that let them superintend the way language is interpreted in many cases, and individuals that feel that their liberty is threatened by particular government action, be it legislation or administration or executive action, they can challenge this in court and they can be heard. And that's a very distinctive part of the American system, that rights are protected through this many layered and very complicated process. It's not as simple as saying that it's the job of the Supreme Court and that's it to protect American rights. It's all of these mechanisms working together. But you contrast that with a state like England, the UK. To go back to the 1990s, before we had the Human Rights Act, what Parliament said the law should be, to simplify terribly, and in a way that sense has stayed with us. So in the British political tradition, rights are protected if Parliament wants to protect rights, and we have a political culture that is very, very sympathetic to individual rights, but they're not protected in the same way as the American system in its very complicated form protects individual rights. And the idea that an individual could go to court and say, well, a piece of legislation is unconstitutional, that is an American invention. That is a real divergence from the British political tradition, although we now have domestic law that has a codification of human rights, and we now have a Supreme Court instead of the House of Lords, and how that works in our system is really still working itself out. But with America internationally, of course, we've been part of writing a lot of international documents, along with many other countries around the world, to try and codify a sense of rights. And so sometimes it's those codifications that are as important as being able to legally defend rights.
But this American experience of negotiating what these inherent rights are of the people, these inalienable rights, putting them into constitutions and laws, and then giving the individuals the rights to hold their government accountable to those, and that the government was under this, that they were under the law, that they were accountable to the law. This is a very fascinating creation and process, and it's a model for the world that these founders created. What happens when the expression of rights comes in conflict with peace and order or democratic sentiments? Can you give me some examples that you've looked at of what happens when you have conflict with these rights?
Well, put it a different way, it's very hard to think of a violent conflict in the world that doesn't have some religious dimension to it across time. That's not to say that religion is the cause of violence. That's not what I'm saying at all, but just that when conflicts occur, there's often an element of disagreement over rights. And so it's actually one of the hardest areas, because it goes right to people's personal beliefs and their sense of morality and their sense of who they are as individuals. So it can be one of the most difficult areas to get a kind of consensus on when we're thinking about negotiating what people's rights are.
Yeah. How did you see that? I mean, I guess when you described this idea of blasphemy and the Quakers feeling like swearing was blasphemous, that was an expression of their deep religious sentiment, that they couldn't do something. To them, it would be a sin, essentially. And they didn't want the government to force them to go there. So they took an oath instead of swearing. And it's so interesting to me because we see this all over the world, how people are forced to violate their conscience. And it's often because the government doesn't understand you can't dictate somebody's conscience. You can't tell them or force them to do something that would put them in a situation that would affect their eternal reality, their whatever they think is going to happen to them when they die, whether it's reincarnation or heaven or hell or whatever that might be. That putting somebody in a position of swearing, whether it was the Quakers or something else, really it undermines the very conscience of humankind. And when so many of these rights are inspired from somebody's religious and moral persuasions, it can be very difficult to navigate that. I mean, we see this all the time in countries where they have blasphemy laws or other laws. And even in early American colonies, we had blasphemy laws. And I mean, there were Quakers like Mary Dyer that were put to death because of these laws. So
and flip it around the other way, because why would anybody insist that somebody swear an oath? Is that just that they want to be oppressive? I don't think that's quite the case. For 17th and 18th century thinkers, that they said if you're going to put people in positions of public trust, you must have confidence that they take the position seriously and that they're not going to betray that trust. And what better way than to ask them to swear an oath and put their immortal soul on the line? And even John Locke, who we remember as a great thinker for religious freedom, drew the line at Catholics because he thought that Catholics had an allegiance to a foreign power, and with atheists because they wouldn't swear oaths, and you couldn't accept somebody in public life not swearing oaths. So that there's always another perspective, and trying to find an accommodation is difficult, because it's not that one side is being totally reasonable and the other side is being totally unreasonable. Often it's that they have slightly different perspectives on the way that society functions, the way that society and the individual relates, and often whether they can trust each other.
Yeah.
And so, again, I never want to just think of people in the past as being more stupid and narrow-minded than we are. These are issues that people have had to work through, and sometimes it's taken centuries to work them through.
Well, it goes right back to what we were saying at the beginning, Nicholas, which is that the process is so important to create confidence and trust amongst one another for an outcome, whether it's establishing what the rules should be in the beginning, taking time to dialogue and to hear one another out and understand one another. That was the American process. I mean, that's what made it work for so long, and what that is what enables us to help have these rights and protect them, and really have a society that embraces them, because of that process of negotiation, of dialogue, of debate, and of understanding one another. And without that, they never would have gotten past the Quakers never would have been able to participate in the government, right? But if they understood, look, I can't do this, it's a violation of my conscience, but I'm committed, then those 3 months of dialogue and debate about these things are really what enabled us to have a country where people could come together across many different perspectives and work together towards a common goal. Of this democratic republic was fascinating, and it's a fascinating example in history of what's possible when people do come together in that way with trust and respect for one another and for understanding one another. I think that's really kind of the key takeaway here.
Well, one of the things that's really striking about a lot of writing in the founding era is how worried people were that republic fragile, that the democratic community fragile, and they thought that because there'd been a lot of thinking across 1,000 years about the fragility of republics. And so this question, what's the duty of the citizen as well as the rights of the citizen, was very alive in people's minds. The most people in this generation who think about it come to is that there is a critical place for education,
Mm,
and that citizens need to be educated to understand how government works, the law works, um, how rights function, and that these things need to be taught to the rising generation. Often the founders reflected that the generation after them would grow up in a republic, whereas they hadn't, and they were worried about education, and they were worried even in their own day that some people didn't take this idea as seriously sometimes as some people would have wished. But I think when they were thinking about the duties of the citizen, maybe one of the most important duties of the citizen is to at least spend part of one's life actually learning about these things and thinking them through and not taking them for granted. Um, and I think if there's a common sense in the founding generation of how citizens should behave, I think it often is to be found in that sense of being educated and thinking things through, so that you're equipped really to take part in these discussions in a sensible and rational way.
well, and I've seen that in our country in particular, that the Constitution has been reduced to, the 10 amendments that you memorize, but you don't really understand. And so you have a lot of citizens that can repeat, you have X, Y, or Z rights, but really don't understand to the extent that the founders wanted us to what that means. How do you navigate that? And in particular, beating a dead horse here, but how you navigate those with people who are different than you, that believe different than you, that have different perspectives than you. And so a lot of the challenges that we see to, let's say, this freedom of conscience and religion in particular, is really a result of that lack of understanding of the nature of this right, and what it meant for the founders, and what it means for us today, and how to navigate a space where people believe very differently, and how we first need to understand their fears, their maybe misconceptions, in order to come together to a place where we can have a common um, respect for one another's freedoms. And that kind of leads me into my next question, which is, many Americans that I meet, unfortunately, believe that freedom of religion is a means to protect their own religion, and not necessarily the religious freedom of others. And this is a challenge we see around the world. People believe it's for them or for their particular religious group or their country and their culture, but not for others. And so, can you share with us what is the correct view of that based on your experience with the U.S. Constitution?
I don't know if I want to say there's a single correct view, but I do want to remember that this was an issue that people really wrestled with in the 18th century just as much as they wrestle with it today, because there are religious duties in all religions that pertain to the individual, and there are religious duties that people believe pertain to the community as well. And so it's finding that balance, and how you respect that, but also allow different religions to live alongside each other, that is really, really difficult. Most of the people in the 18th century who wrote about that issue talked about equal respect, that that no group should have any particular privilege, and that groups should be protected equally, and that there was a sort of reciprocity. And so that if there was any claim you wanted to make, for your own freedom of religion, it had to be a claim that didn't interfere with anybody else's claims of religious freedom. And ultimately, I think that's where religiously diverse communities have to end up, that there has to be a mutual respect and understanding for different religious groups. But I think we also need to acknowledge that this is again a difficult issue that involves questions of detail as well as sort of high level philosophical principle, and communities need to be given the tools and the space to think this through, rather than just be told, well, there's a single right answer to all of these questions, and here it is, and it can be found in whatever document, just adopt this. But you know, again, these are issues that generations and generations of America have wrestled with, and America is still sorting out exactly where the balance lies on particular questions. And there are cases before the Supreme Court all the time that seek to address, you know, tiny amounts of detail on these points, even if you know most people sign up to the big picture thing. So communities around the world are not facing, you know, unique challenges here. These are challenges that all diverse communities face.
Well, and what's so interesting about the debates that took place during the Constitutional Convention is that these were, for the most part, a pretty homogeneous group of Christians, very diverse in their theological perspectives within that range. But if they were having this much discussion over these issues, now that America is much more diverse, you can imagine how much more debate we're having. When we look at this issue, whether it's here or around the world, one of the things we really point out or try to identify are the fears that people have. And so during the Constitutional Convention, what were those fears that that some of the different founding fathers expressed over their fears of other religions or faiths, communities within the Constitution? What were you hearing them say?
So the convention itself, because it doesn't discuss a Bill of Rights,
Right.
tends to avoid these issues. But there is a sort of overarching fear, which is that particular communities will be overwhelmed by other communities. So, you know, we think of that in terms of big states and small states sometimes, or you know, landlocked states versus states that have access to the coast, which is obviously important for trade, and of course for the 18th century, slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, states that had the opportunity to expand westward, and states that didn't. You know, that there's this fear about one particular community losing out to other communities, and that's where a lot of the compromise has to occur, is how will decision-making processes be balanced to reassure different parts of the American Union that their voice isn't going to be lost.
How does the American experience compare with the creation of some of the other constitutions that were designed to establish new democratic forms of government? So France, India, Britain. Can you share a little bit about your perspective on those?
Most, though not all, states since the American Revolution have had some kind of convention process. You know, I certainly think that's the sort of majority have sort of followed the American experience. Though many of those conventions have been public, state conventions in the 19th century and 20th century have been very public affairs, and around the world, again, not always, but many constitution writing processes are very, very public. So if we think of India in 1946, their Constituent Assembly took 3 years, not 3 months, to write their constitution. And they did so very publicly. And there's a lot of public debate at the time about provisions that should be adopted or not adopted. We see this in America at state level throughout the 19th century as well. A lot of newspaper comment on the work of state conventions as they're going along. So in fact, the 1787 convention is a little bit unusual for meeting in secret, and is about sort of average in terms of the time that it took, with 3 months. You know, the other end of the one end of the spectrum, you know, India takes 3 years to write a much longer and more detailed constitutional text, and other states have done it much more quickly, and maybe with smaller groups, and not every state's copied the American model of a constitutional convention. But America's founding generation was very proud of the idea. Hamilton even writes it in Federalist One, that one of the purposes of America in the world is to show to mankind whether states can be governed, he says, through reflection and choice. In other words, can they sit down and write their constitutional texts and debate these things out, or must they always be governed by constitutions like Britain's that have grown up through accident and often violent force? And I think he got his wish. A very large part of the world has decided that, yes, the sort of American model of discussing rationally a constitutional text that describes decision-making and sorts out fundamental issues, that is a very sensible way to organize politics. Where states have often differed from America, though, is in writing a lot more detail into their constitutional texts. The American Constitution is a very short document. Most of the sort of detail has had to be worked out through legislation or court judgments. And if you compare it to, say, foundational texts for the European Union, or foundational texts for India, or even some of America's more recent state constitutions, so modern constitutional texts tend to be a lot more detailed and spell out sometimes rights in much more detail, but often as well policy in a way that the federal text doesn't. So many more things get moved into constitutional texts. But I think there's no denying that America's been incredibly influential in the kind of way Hamilton suggested it might be.
Can you explain a little bit about their approach to religion in the different constitutions, like in India, for instance, or France? Or
France is a very good example, which has come to have a different understanding of religious freedom to Britain and to America. So in Britain, we still have an established church, although it's very conscious, I think, now that it's actually a minority religion itself, which is rather interesting. But it's very careful in its official functions to behave in particular ways, to emphasize it's a steward of historic buildings, and to be very careful in the sort of political interventions it makes. America has its version of religious freedom with very strong protections for the individual, and a constant argument about exactly how much expression of religion is allowed in the public sphere, or in schools, or other places, or how much support there can be from the state to religious groups, or how much religious groups can be involved in charitable activities supported by the state. These kinds of questions. France takes a different position again, and says complete separation of the public sphere and religion. Religion is not only a private matter, but one that must remain private, even down to banning personal expressions of religion in the public sphere. Although I think there's always some suspicion that kind of provision is not actually enforced equally, or isn't felt by groups equally, and so they run into problems there. So there are different models for religious freedom around the world, but they hinge on the same questions that Madison was wrestling with, which is state licensing of religion or not, whether the state can sort of compel individuals to behave in particular ways as part of their religious duties, whether the state is involved in the provision of religious education, or in the financial support of religion. These questions that are debated in the American founding are still the foundational questions for every state looking at this issue, even though different states come out with different answers on some of them.
And what about in India? Can you tell me a little bit about, because that's fascinating, since something major happened out of India.
Yeah, so India's an interesting. So India is a much more religiously diverse community in 1946 than America had been at its founding. And although the constitutional text in India has strong protections for religion, the the work of the Constituent Assembly was not enough to reassure the Muslim population of India that they would be protected. And so even, you know, the Constituent Assembly's work hadn't even reached a midway point before Pakistan is formed through partition, and that comes out of just a mistrust between groups that is just irreconcilable. So not every story here is a positive one.
Well, and it's interesting.
And to this day, India still wrestles with questions of religious freedom and in particular laws surrounding conversion from one religion to another, and so on. So, you know, again, there are issues for India to grapple with as well, because they are such a diverse population.
Well, in many ways, the issues have been exacerbated. And it's interesting, in Pakistan, they started out with Muhammad Jinnah supporting this idea of freedom of religion, even in Pakistan. But it's been very interesting that in both states, they've struggled with this idea for me, but not for you, which is what we were talking about earlier. And that's where this great American experiment is so fascinating, because Jefferson was always very clear. It's not just for me. I mean, he was experienced with communities of Muslims and of Hindus and people of different faiths around the world. And he said, you might not agree with them, but it's for everybody. It's not just for one. And that space where people can have a marketplace of ideas and debate them and challenge one another and come to their own conscience and idea of what they believe in was really fundamental to that experience. So,
but even for a figure like Jefferson, you know, Jefferson had to be prepared to put his full weight behind the idea of religious freedom. When the University of Virginia is being founded, people often talk about it as Mr. Jefferson's University, and Jefferson wanted it to be a place of religious freedom, and that meant that it was actually very hard in the Virginia of his day to get support for that kind of institution. People worried that it would be a godless university because of now. In fact, the university campus, anyone who's been to Charlottesville will know it's surrounded by churches and religious communities. But you know, Jefferson really had to fight for that principle of a university, even that, you know, with principles of religious freedom embedded within it, and he had to be prepared to really fight for that in the face of attacks that were very suspicious of him and suspicious of his own religious beliefs. And again, I think that's a reassuring story in a way, that it wasn't the case that, well, Virginia just passed a statute in 1786 on religious freedom and then had never thought about that issue ever again. It remained a difficult topic for people to think about. Well, you know, am I going to let my you know, teenage child go off to a university that has this sort of non-denominational founding?
Right. Well, and this is the issue that we see around the world with religious freedom as well. It's either construed as well, that means you're going to get rid of religion, like essentially like France or Turkey have done. And, you know, they've tried to suppress religion because religion is a problem, let's say, in some minds, like religion, just keep it out of sight, out of mind. Right. And so people can see it that way, or the other extreme, religious freedom being used to preference one religion and faith over all the others. And the challenge, and you know, what's amazing about the American experience is that they were able to come together in the middle and say it's neither, really. It's a space where we can all believe differently, where you can be religious in your state or in your federal government. You can bring your morals and your values into office, but you know, there's no establishment of religion, and people have the ability to freely exercise their faith. It's fascinating how they came to that. And in so many other states, they failed. I mean, you'd look at constitutions in other countries where that process that allowed them to come to that, and that process that created the Constitution. I can't remember what state it was, but I mean, well, in France, we saw numerous revolutions, right, after the first one. But in many countries, they have had multiple constitutions. They can't get it right. Do you want to share a little bit about that, just from your experience? Why in particular has the American Constitution survived so long when other constitutions have failed?
I think the American system has so many outlets for these discussions in some ways. But I think as well, it has become part of the American belief about themselves as a nation, that they are a land of religious freedom. Sometimes exaggerating the extent to which, you know, particular generations in America's past have actually been in favor of religious freedom, but there are these national stories in America that really help people think about the idea of being a land of religious freedom, and then providing Americans with lots of spaces to debate these issues. It's not as if these issues are prohibited from public debate. There is a very, very lively debate in America about the place of religion in the public sphere, and about how the state should relate to religious organizations, and even how religious organizations relate to each other, and what the rights of conscience are, and what it's acceptable to say, and, you know, how insulting can you be of somebody else's faith and religion. I mean, these are all issues that America is able to debate, and I think that's really the key, that it's not as if that debate has ever been completely closed off. You know, it's not as if America has said, well, we've just got a rule about this now, and we're never talking about it again, because I think that does lead to frustrations, and people become angry about that kind of situation. This is a debate that America is confident having,
Yeah,
and is
not afraid
confident
of.
continuing to have.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think that very thing that the founding fathers came to this wanting to have their own freedom of conscience, wanting to be able to believe what they want, being open to hearing other ideas was critical to every other freedom and right and debate that occurred in that era. Was they believed in the freedom of conscience that allowed them to debate things and overcome their fears and misunderstandings of one another, and really come to a common goal with this Constitution that, although imperfect, has for many years given us such great freedom and liberty. So
I think they also understood that they couldn't be a community unless they were prepared to find a way of accommodating each
yeah,
other. You know,
ultimately that's it,
you
right?
know, there
Either
was
all hang
enough
or we figure out how to get together and work it out.
yes,
Usually it's
or there
easy
isn't a
rock
United
bottom that
States
you're
of America.
willing to work together, unfortunately. But
Absolutely.
yeah, you've often told us that it doesn't only matter what was achieved in the Constitution, but how it was achieved. Can you share a little bit more about what you mean by that?
I think it comes back to this idea of being willing to not only debate issues, but take seriously a process that allows issues to be debated, and to be willing to trust that process and submit to its outcome.
Yeah.
And if you can't get to that point, then you really can't start to solve big questions at all.
Yeah.
And I think previous generations had more of a sense than we sometimes do of how important the structures to support that kind of debate were. And, you know, there's a reason that legislatures around the world have complicated rules of procedure and complicated traditions, and, you know, do things in a particular way, and it's down to this: it's providing a space for issues to be aired and thought about and talked about sometimes over and over again in order to reach an outcome that people have confidence in. And we're a very impatient generation. You talked earlier about social media. We want it done right now. We want to short circuit all of those processes. We want people to put their piece of legislation in front of whatever legislative body it is and just ram it through. And you can win those battles in the short term. Of course you can. You can have votes at state or federal level to just ram through particular issues. But what you destroy along the way is trust in the institutions. And so, that's, why I'm so interested in this process of negotiation and the fact that, across centuries, people have been willing to buy into particular forms of negotiation, when it comes to writing law and when it comes to writing constitutions. And more often than not, those processes have been successful. Not always. Sometimes constitutional conventions in the United States have broken up without agreement. Sometimes they've agreed a text and then voters have rejected it. It's not always a successful story, but in the American case, more often than not, it has been. And that's important. But it's not that they just got the right answers, it's that they took the time to get there and they approached that process seriously.
It's so critical. I think that's such an important point, especially now. I feel like in our culture today, that's the message that we need to hear more than anything. Allow the process to work. It's there for a reason. Yeah. I think I would add to that, not just trust in the institution, but it destroys trust in individuals and one another, which is what enables institutions to work. In your view, as a historian, how do we understand our rights and feel our responsibility to protect the rights of others? Last thoughts.
There are many people around the world working to suggest that actually our future shouldn't be a democratic one. When I was younger, I think we took for granted the idea that the future of the world was going to be democratic, that actually the sort of American vision had won. There was even a book that many of your listeners might be familiar with, The End of History, and it made this case that liberal democracy had won. People now accepted that there was just a good way to organize society, and that was the end of it. And that's not the case. There are people who either don't care enough about democratic institutions because they just want to win on particular issues, or there are governments around the world that want to promote a different way of organizing the state and think that the future I say that again. You want to say that the future of the world should not necessarily be a democratic one and should not be one with individual liberty. So I think we probably do have a duty to care about that, and to think about it and to think how we can better understand the institutions that we've inherited, think about what we want to change and develop, think about how we want to strengthen those institutions, and think about how we recommit to that kind of rational process of debate, because there are alternative futures that are not small L liberal and democratic. And I think if we have a duty together, it's actually to care about that issue and not take it for granted.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to take for granted the rights and freedoms that we have. And it's been such just an honor to hear how you've spent so much time delving into all of the founding documents and understanding the process and how it came about, because at this time is when we need to remember that, and remember that is really so critical to ensure that we don't take our freedoms for granted, that we can have them for perpetuity, that we can, like you said, teach the next generation and so forth. So I encourage everyone to go check out the Quill Project and learn more. And I'm excited to see all the different states. I think you're working on Hawaii as well, isn't that right?
It's on our list. We haven't got
Okay.
it exactly right, but there'll be lots more to come, and
I'm
and
excited.
especially the reconstruction amendments later this year.
Yeah.
Which
Oh,
is
that's going to
pretty
be
exciting.
fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and I look forward to connecting soon.